Sebastian Ashford, the Earl of Thornfield, never told anyone the vow he made to himself, but he knew well enough how it was. Today was Sebastian's wedding day, but today was also a reminder to himself that this woman who walked toward him at his wedding today was not a bride at his altar, but rather an obligation to pay. The woman was Margaret Harlow, 23 years old, and the only daughter of Lord Edmund Harlow, a gentleman who, at least within the proper drawing rooms of London, was considered by some to be a man of respect. Yet Sebastian Ashford knew his father's name all too well. When he was just 14 years old, he watched his father march out of a prison, handcuffed and walking away with nothing. His father had been convicted of treason, lost his title, lands, and has had his name wiped off the pages of history. It was all because of Lord Edmund Harlow. Lord Edmund Harlow had been a close companion and confidant of Sebastian's father since they were childhood friends. When Lord Edmund Harlow's criminal activity threatened to be exposed, he did what cowards do. He placed the blame on an innocent individual. 15 months later, James Ashford died inside of the prison he had been sentenced to, totally depleted and all but erased. He died broken, forgotten, and replaced. Sebastian now had nothing but a borrowed name. He had a cold determination. He carried with him nothing but the list of names, just one name. For the last 15 years, Sebastian had quietly and silently rebuilt his life from the ashes of the former Earl, C.I.E. James, through law school and trade in Europe. He also returned to England as a new person, i.e., $20 million wealth. He was now the current Earl of Thornfield, and nobody made the connection to the disgraced Ashford boy. Nobody knew who he was or how he had rebuilt. Edmund Harlow was drowning, $30 million in debt, and had just been served foreclosure on his estate. He was being hunted down by several creditors and was, quite literally, 2 days before losing his family name. Every move to destroy Harlow's name had been completed during the last 6 years at the hands of Sebastian. Now that Edmund stood in front of him, literally, hat in hand, and with no pride, only an offer. I have a daughter. She is smart, she has been educated and is well behaved. Your daughter will be a great wife for any man, said Edmund with an air of nonchalance. Sebastian had carefully observed the appearance of the man sitting across from him at the table. He appeared to share the same weakness in his jaw as did his father. His father had also had the same caregiver-looking eyes that had always done the same type of math before he spoke. At that point, the only difference between the men was that he had signed a false confession to the police. Sebastian made the official announcement of his acceptance and gave the impression that Edmund could relax. But ultimately, Edmund wasn't able to do so. Sebastian first met Margaret in a miraculously gray Tuesday afternoon on the first week of the new month, only 3 weeks before their wedding, at the estate of the Harlow family. He was there for a social call. However, his true motive was to do an assessment of the landscaping to signal to Edmund that his father would be at the center of a quick and effortless closure to this estate. What he hadn't planned on doing was seeing Margaret. Upon his arrival, he found Margaret standing on a very tall stool in front of the high shelves of the library, searching for some long-lost book, her back still toward him and completely unaware of his presence. The housekeeper will take you to the drawing room. Father will join you shortly, as he has an engagement with some friends in the area. Margaret stated matter-of-factly without looking back toward him. I believe I am due an invitation for an appointment with your father," Sebastian said in response to her comment. A pause soon followed as she turned to look at him, no longer having to create an idea of who his imagined idea was to be. Rather, this woman in front of him did not fit his preconceived notions of what she should be. Where he had thought she would be soft and spoiled, she stood before him with an expression like he would see on himself. Looking directly at him, she spoke, "Lord Thornfield." But it was not in the form of either a question or a greeting. "You are early," followed by his retort, "I am precise." Again, there was a slight change in her facial features, in that it was neither a smile nor the opposite of one. "My father has spoken to me regarding your arrangement, and I am in agreement with it." At this point, he had prepared for tears. He had prepared for her to go into a state of quiet acceptance. Directness in her was something that had not come to him prior to this moment. "I expect to have a well-run household that is kept private and is to operate according to the terms of our contract. And what will I receive in return? I will pay all of your family's debts, and your father's name will be kept safe, for now." She nodded her head slowly, as though she had just been presented with an offer for a business arrangement rather than a marriage. "I will agree," she said, "on one condition. I cannot be used as a weapon against my family. Whatever happened between you and my father, and I know something happened, I won't allow myself to be the means of his destruction. If you agree to that, then I'll be the wife you need." The silence that followed was the first time in 6 years that Sebastian Ashford felt something. Besides the cold, hard certainty he had come to expect from life. He did not agree to her condition, but for the first time since those 6 long years had passed, he was not 100% sure he disagreed with it. The ceremony was short, cold, and very well organized. Sebastian stood at the altar as he watched Margaret walk down the aisle by herself, with her father one step behind her, but looking terribly small and weak. He had never seen his daughter look so good before, but he did not even recognize her because of the way she had dressed. The entire ceremony took place without her wearing a veil or carrying flowers. Instead, she walked along the aisle more like the way a person would walk after having made peace with themselves regarding their choices, with the grace of somebody who didn't think it was possible to ever feel any such grace again. He had never expected to feel anything. There was sensation on his part. When father of the royal household, S.H., married them, S.B. leaned over and in a whisper so soft it was only for her benefit said, "Welcome to Thornfield. Lady Ashford, now is the time that your father's longest debt has come due." She did not react other than to look back with her careful gaze and say just as quietly back to him, "I know." She then turned to share her greetings with their friends in attendance, using an expression of peace which would have been identified as peace by each and every person in that church. S.B. stood there watching her for longer than he realized. "I know." 2 words. And somehow everything was now unbalanced. Thornfield was formed according to design by S.B., kept that way by him. Marg got her mistress title and held it with enough competence that S.B. was irritated with, to prove to be successful, without him being able to articulate how this was so. The servants expected tension, but found a woman who learned their names in a week and managed the estate's accounts with the precision of a former steward who was a sham. Sebastian expected to have to help Margaret, to guide her through tons of new experiences. However, she did not ask for help from him. They ate dinner with little fanfare while consuming each other's company. He was reading letters, which he was rude enough to not hide, and she was occasionally reading letters. Neither would look away from the other when they made eye contact. They had no weapons, but there seemed to be a contest for who would not look away from each other first. One evening, Sebastian returned home from his attorney's office earlier than expected, and when he walked by Margaret's sitting room, he stopped to listen. He heard Margaret speaking. "I'm searching for it for 3 years," Margaret said. "I don't know if it is still around. I hope he has not destroyed it." "And what if you find it?" the other voice asked, after a pause. "If I find it, I will give it to someone who can use it, and then whatever happens after I accept." Sebastian was perfectly still as he stood in the hallway. What was it that she was searching for? And for whom? Sebastian's perspective on Margaret changed after this experience. He no longer viewed her as someone suspiciously, but rather attentively. He realized that there was danger in the attention he gave her, and it seemed to him that she used her attention to play games with him. He noticed how she carefully directed her actions toward avoiding her father's presence at the estate. Not by being rude, but by making it look as though she is practicing being away from him. Throughout this period, Sebastian would learn of things Margaret had done without any acknowledgement, and no one else in the household was aware of them. For example, Margaret quietly redirected some donations intended for the estate to a charity that assisted families of men falsely accused of crimes. She was not trying to gain attention by doing this. She did it quietly. It seemed to him that Margaret had been engaging in this behavior for many years without anyone else becoming aware of it. Later that evening, during a particularly rainy day, Sebastian and Margaret sat in the library, the fire burning low. He was reading, and she was reading, until Margaret stopped and gazed at Sebastian. At that point, she looked at him with tired eyes, as though she had given up being careful. "I know what my father did," Margaret said. Sebastian immediately froze. "I have known since I was 17. I found a letter my father had written to the court when Lord Ashford was trial, and the letter was a draft of the letter he sent to the court giving testimony against Lord Ashford. He thought he had burned the letter, but he had not done so. There were many things I did not understand, but I knew he did not do the right thing." Sebastian questioned her in an emotionless tone about whether or not she had the original letter as well. "I buried it," she responded, and told him that she had wanted to find a way to use that letter without destroying her in the process. Sebastian broke his gaze from her. Everything he had constructed was now rearranging itself around a single woman who was looking for a similar solution to the same problem he had been searching for over 6 years. "Why didn't you ask for help? Why didn't you go to the courts?" "I would have never been believed," were her simple words. "That was my father's daughter. A woman against her own father. I was looking for more." Her eyes looked at him. "That's why I agreed to marry you." Sebastian's breath caught in his throat. "And you knew? You were James Ashford's son?" She gave a pause and then replied, "I suspected. The timing, the looks you gave at my father, and that a man with your wealth and possibilities would have chosen me." That was the longest pause and silence Sebastian had ever had in his life. Sebastian found the documents regarding James Ashford and what he did to Margaret. They were found together when they, unearthed the knowledge of Margaret's father and his ways and means. They were found behind a panel in Edmund's father study, precisely where Margaret remembered as a child. They included a draft document and, surprisingly, a second document that included payment for 2 witnesses. This was proof that the testimonies against James Ashford were not only false, but paid for. That was enough, and more than enough. Sebastian now stood in the study with this new information and felt what he had waited 15 years for. However, when he felt it, he also realized it was not what he had expected. He anticipated the feeling would be one of victory. Instead, he felt something much scarier than any battle he had ever trained for. He felt the weight of the choice. Sebastian could destroy Edmund Harlow entirely. He could destroy Edmund in a very public manner and watch him be totally and completely destroyed in every way imaginable, just as they had done to James Ashford. Justice would be proportional and identical to what happened to James Ashford. However, Margaret would also be destroyed because she is his, Edmund, daughter. Therefore, her name will suffer the consequences of what he will do now. Likewise, too, her social status and future for which she forfeited her life. He remained silent for an extended time within the office. After that long silence, he decided to go find his wife. "I will take this matter before the courts. I will petition the court for the appellate court to examine and overturn my father's conviction, restoring both his title and his name to his descendants." At that point, he paused. Therefore, there will be no public humiliation for Edmund through this process. Margaret looked at him. "You could completely wipe him out. You have sufficient proof." "I understand. He deserves it." "I agree." Margaret was relatively motionless. "Why?" she asked. "Because," Sebastian said when he had regained his composure, "when I began this endeavor, William did not motivate me." The words fell between them like the conclusion of an undeserving argument. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Her grief had existed before. She was relieved of the burden of it. "I apologize," she said softly. "I regret what my father did to your father." Sebastian turned to the woman he had married to use against his father and found that she was alone for years fighting against her father too. "I apologize," Sebastian said as well, "for what I wanted to do to you." Neither of them had made a declaration, neither of them had made a vow, but both of them had finally said the first truthful thing that they could to one another. And that was enough to begin again. Lord James Ashford's conviction had been overturned 14 months later. His title and estate had been restored to him. Sebastian accepted his title and estate not with a sense of victory, but more quietly. Closure. Edmund Harlow, confronted with the evidence against him, withdrew from Parliament and from having any role in public life. His daughter chose not to destroy him, but she also chose to not forgive him. She told Sebastian that she wasn't ready to forgive, and it was possible that she would never be ready to forgive. Sebastian understood that. In the years following its establishment, Thornfield Estate was noted by neighboring communities for the quality of life within its grounds because of the marriage of its owner's creation of a carefully constructed home based upon many aspects of life's disasters, including the union and eventual dissolution of two people. This is not a fantasy. This is not a history. It was a unique event, a marriage based on planning that turned into a truth. On a winter's night, long after the courts had turned over the last of the Ashford case, when Margaret entered the library to find her husband, who had first engaged in conversation with her as he sat in a chair reading, she placed a cup of tea for him on the table and did not say any words. He glanced up from his work, looked directly at her, and she looked directly at him. At that moment, they were both completely free from the constraints of their previous business dealings with one another.